The Chinese regime persecutes Christians in China. Portraits of communist leaders placed inside churches. Prisoners of conscience arrested for their faith. At the International Religious Freedom Summit, I spoke with the head of two Christian organizations advocating for the stop of persecution against Christians and other faith in China. I speak with Jeff King from International Christian Concern and David Curry from Open Doors USA on the state of China's human rights and religious records, what Americans can do to help. Mr. Jeff King, thank you so much for joining us today for this discussion.
Absolutely, yeah, thank you.
Tell us your concerns with the situation in China.
Well, the situation is the complete lack of religious freedom. The only religious freedom that really exists is if you're with a government-controlled church, and then you're not really a church. So you've got everything from the control of the three self-churches, there's the free churches, the imprisonment of activists, and pastors. So it's a conglomeration of things that just reflects really the whole of the Chinese Marxist government and what they're doing with freedom in general, but especially directed at Christians.
And we talked about this just kind of off camera about the nature of the communist regime, right?
Yeah.
It's religion is kind of against the nature of the atheist government, the Marxist government, the communist government. How does that play into their attempt to say, well, religion like Christianity is in China, but like you said, it is heavily controlled?
Absolutely heavily controlled. In fact, as I think we spoke earlier before, and we touched on, so many people, if you ask them on the streets in China, does China have religious freedom? And they would say yes. They're not aware, or even how big the church is. So, they absolutely are an enemy of the church. They're enemies of religious freedom because religious freedom is such a potent force for democracy. It's such a potent force against the Marxist regime, the mafia that controls China. Because what is religious freedom? Religious freedom is a conglomeration of rights. It's the right to assemble. It's a right to conscience, to free speech, et cetera, et cetera. So anyways, as you know, the Marxist government is completely against it. They're trying to strangle the church slowly. The only thing is that the despot and the dictator never seem to learn, and especially the Marxists in China, that the more they squeeze, the more they push down, the more the church spreads, and they can't seem to understand this.
Makes you wonder why their attempt to stamp out religion and the ideas of religion in China, but it's a fire they can't put out, right? It burns even harder. The ideas of freedom around the world, international freedom of religion, and the ideas of democracy is almost the opposite of what the Chinese government is doing.
It absolutely is. I mean, you think about what they're doing. They're the antithesis of freedom. And they're taking this, today with technology, it's not just the church, it's the whole system, but the whole social credit system, the mass surveillance coupled with AI and the databases, where, and the frightening thing is that they're exporting this to the world. They feel absolutely fine about this. This is, to them, a legitimate form of government, even though it's just a mafia. It's a small mafia controlling over 1 billion people, and they're exporting this to other countries. But they have no qualms about it. They're not friends of democracy. They're not friends of freedom. It's all about control. It's eerily similar to a mafia. That's what it is.
How do you feel about the situation with the Catholic Church, with the Vatican, and especially in Hong Kong? We've seen that they're trying to really control Catholicism there.
Yes.
Your thoughts on that?
Well, I'd have to say, if you catch me in an honest moment, I would say, I understand what happened with the Catholic Church. They made an agreement with Beijing, but I think it's unfortunate. But when the gun is pressed against their head and they said, listen, do you want to have any Catholic Church? They said yes. So they allowed partial control of the Catholic Church by Xi and by the propaganda arm of the party. So that's disappointing. At the same time, in the real world, I think the church says we're going to take the long view and we're going to outlive this Marxist regime. So we'll bend for right now, but we won't break. So,
which is interesting because Christians have gone through persecution in history, as well as many religions, but yet the will to continue, right? It almost seems... I know the Chinese regime doesn't understand why people believe in religions and hence why they want to stamp it out. But what do you think is the core of that value that keeps people going?
Well, if you ask me, look, I'm a Christian. I would say because there is a God and there's this insatiable desire for us to know this thing that people sense. There's this sense that there's a God out there and people want to know it. And you can't stamp that out. There's a there's a God-sized hole in each of our hearts as a human being. Now, people pursue the filling of that hole in lots of different ways, which is the essence of religious freedom. It can't be just Christianity or whatever sect believes their answer is the answer. We have to allow religious freedom for all, but they just can't get that, and it's so obvious. It's stunning because it's so simplistic that you can't. This is a drive in human beings that's just not quenchable. And the more you try to quench it, again, the more it spreads. And they can't seem to look at their own history and see this. I mean, the Chinese church at the time of the Marxist takeover was not that large, and now it's massive. And in fact, the Christian church in China is exporting their faith to the world. The missionaries are going out to the world. It's a very well-known fact. And the Chinese church, of all the churches I visit in the world, the Chinese church is one of the most vibrant, one of the most godly, vibrant churches. They're heroes to me. And for years I visited and met with many pastors that have been in prison for 15, 20 years. And I just don't understand what this old guard administration is thinking, because they just have to look back at their own history. And at different times, different administrations have said, look, it's not worth it. It's not worth the hassle we get from the West. And in the end, the Christians aren't a threat to us. So why do they do it? And then, now this is a throwback administration and they're so hardcore, but all they're going to do is fuel the spread of the church. You watch, and this is what will happen.
What's the situation like in China right now? For example, if you went to China, can you go to a church and you practice the same way you would here in the West?
No. I mean, so first of all, with me, I'm a walking neon sign, apart from the fact that I'm American, because they would know full well who I am. And so years past, when I wasn't as well known, I could sneak into underground churches, but still very high security, in and out. And then still they're going to get visits and say, who was the American?
I see.
So, so I could go to a government-controlled church probably, and that'd be fine, because that'd be a propaganda win for them.
Right.
But I would never even go to the underground churches at this point, because all you're doing is bringing the state in and turning people over to them, because they'd be watching.
But the underground is where the majority of the Christians in China are?
Yeah, I think that's true statistically. I mean, many had made the decision to say, we'll go along with the government and kind of play along.
Okay.
But I think the most vibrant churches are still, and there's a lot of good Three Self churches, but I think the most vibrant and the fastest growing are the underground churches, the non-registered.
And I want to kind of zoom out a little bit with not just China, but with religious persecutions around the world. The general theme to me seems to be that they are against what they stand for in a superficial level, but also at the core of it, how the religion itself teaches moral values, right? For example, Christianity, it teaches to love your neighbors, to love people, and for Buddhism, it teaches to salvation and so forth. But with these, I guess, authoritarian regimes or totalitarian regimes, why does that aspect seem to be what they can't afford to have people believe in?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And furthermore, with Christianity, it teaches us to obey the authorities. By all means, obey the authorities, unless unless they're doing things against Scripture. So that is a curious thing. But again, I always go back. I think the simplest way to understand the Chinese administration or another dictatorship or despot is that this is a mafia. It's a small group of people, and they're controlling the larger community, and they do it by threats and bribe and violence, extreme violence. And once you understand that, and there's this posturing where the emperor has no clothes, and yet they insist they have clothes. And so I think another system that's being worshipped, they're the only object of worship. That's the deal. That's the twist on the mafia analogy, but they also have to be worshipped. And it's a false worship, and it never can feed the soul, and so it never works, and they know that. So the hearts of the people are always turning to this other system, and they hate that. So.
And David Satter, who is a scholar from the Hudson Institute, and he does a lot of studies on Russian communism and communism in general. He mentioned something earlier this week, or last week actually, was about communism being a false religion. And you just touched on the idea that they need to believe in a separate system.
Yes.
How does that work exactly, maybe?
Well, and that's the other thing. Again, the mafia concept breaks down a little bit, because it is a false system of worship, and that's what they're purposefully creating. And on the one hand, they'll say, there is no God. We're an atheist state. And yet they hold themselves up as a God, and they hold the state up as a God to be worshipped, and to their rules are to be obeyed, and the party is to be venerated. So they're setting themselves up as a religion. It's clear. And if you want to see the height of this, look at North Korea. And they purposely did it. They purposely studied Christianity.
Really?
Yes, and they said we're gonna do Juche theology, which is all a twist on Christianity. Just knowing that people have this innate desire to find God, this innate desire for something deeper and spiritual, and they created a false system. So it's clear in all the Marxist systems. But again, if you want to see it most clearly, you go to North Korea.
Well, Jeff King, thank you so much for coming on and answering all the questions today, and appreciate you.
David, thank you so much, and everything you guys are doing.